Welcome back to another episode of the Network Nations mini-series on the Green Pill podcast. I'm Felix Beer, and together with Primavera De Filippi, I'm your co-host for the coming episodes. Across the world, new kinds of civic communities are beginning to take shape. Communities that use decentralized technologies to govern themselves, steward shared resources, and act together across borders. We call them Network Nations, and in this series, we want to explore Network Nations as a new design space for civic society in the digital age. Our goal is to chart an alternative pathway from the network state, one where technology serves civil society and not the other way around. Instead of reproducing today's power imbalances in network societies, we're asking, what if network societies were built from the bottom up as shared commons, rather than from the top down as startup ventures? What if they treated members as co-creators rather than customers? And what if they cultivated a sense of sovereignty as a collective good for the many, rather than a private asset owned by the few? Each episode brings together thinkers, builders, and organizers who are exploring this new frontier of community self-governance, helping us to imagine how civil society can reclaim political agency in the age of networks. To dive deeper, visit our website, networknations.networks, where you'll find our manifesto and many ways to connect with our communities. In this episode, we want to discuss the emerging concept of network sovereignty, a concept that explores how power is shifting from nation states to the digital networks that increasingly organize our contemporary life. Think about how much of your daily life runs through digital networks, how you communicate with your friends, do your job, organize events, follow the news, or even make sense of what's happening in the world. All of this runs through digital infrastructures of connectivity. And these networks often feel like neutral tools, but in fact, they're not just connecting us, they're shaping us. They're influencing what we see, who gets attention, which voices are amplified, and which actions are easy or hard to take. In other words, networks are becoming increasingly the new substrate of governance in our societies. While in the 20th century, sovereignty was largely a territorial term, which meant states exercised authority over land and its populations, in the 21st century, sovereign power is increasingly networked. It emerges from the design and the control, and indeed also the ownership of digital infrastructures. In this way, platforms are starting to resemble virtual territories. Protocols function like rule-setting institutions, and algorithms are increasingly functioning as sort of policies. This is what we mean by network sovereignty, a shift from nation states to digital infrastructures as the medium of political power. And if Marshall McLuhan famously put it, the medium is the message, then those who control the medium, of course, increasingly also control the message. And indeed, what we are observing in our contemporary world is a shift in the geopolitics. Governments, corporations, and civil societies are increasingly trying to control or reclaim this new digital territory of networks. The central question then is not longer whether or how networks are governing our societies. They already do in many instances. But the question increasingly becomes who controls these networks and in which interests are they being designed. To help us make sense of this shift, we are joined today by Nick Srnicek and Sofia Cossar. Nick is a political theorist and a senior lecturer in digital economy at the King's College in London. His work on platform capitalism has been central to the understanding of how economic and political power concentrates in network systems. And his most recent book, Silicon Empires, examines the political economy of AI. Sofia Cossar is a close collaborator of mine and a researcher at BlockchainGov, where she studies governance, law, and institutional design in decentralized systems. Her work mainly focuses on how networked communities and blockchain communities indeed experiment with new forms of collective decision-making, ownerships, and membership regimes. Sofia and I are also running a research program on network sovereignty and are currently writing an academic article, which was kind of the backbone for this conversation. Together, we'll unpack what sovereignty means in a networked age and what it would take to reclaim networks as infrastructures for democratic self-determination rather than control. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, Sofia. Hi, Nick. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. So today we will discuss the concept of network sovereignty and more specifically the question of how networks as entities become political actors maybe in their own right. There's a lot of interesting, I think, threads we can draw on. Nick has been working on the question of platform capitalism for a long time. Sophia and I are currently co-writing a paper on the idea of network sovereignty. So these are some of the ideas we want to unpack together. But before we jump into political questions, we want to first zoom in and ask the more general question of what it actually means to live in a network age these days. I think we all are people who are extremely online at this point. So lots of our life runs through apps. We are always surrounded by smart devices, live in smart homes, live in smart cities. So our lives are currently very networked, which kind of begs the question to which extent it is still conceivable to live outside of networks. So what does it really mean to live in the network age, and what is the implication for us as citizens? Nick, do you want to grab the first question?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, from my sort of perspective, I've been focused a lot on platforms in my research, and platforms as this business model that's been taken up by a number of different companies around the world, and increasingly the largest companies in the world all being sort of platform business models. And I think one of the key things about them is that they end up becoming quite pervasive in whatever sector that they're involved in. Because of this drive of network effects, they end up sort of dominating their particular markets and industries. And you end up with a sort of quite centralized platform. And then there's been sort of research from people like John Christopher Plantin, who's talked about platforms as infrastructures as well. And I think this is a really important way to look at platforms, is not just as a business model, not just as a sort of intermediary between different groups, but also as something which underpins core elements of our social lives, political lives, economic lives. I don't think there was necessarily any sort of intention for these things to become infrastructures when they first sort of developed, but the way in which they have grown means that they have taken on this infrastructural capacity. And by this, I sort of mean that there's an asymmetry that lots of people are relying upon a few key providers of this stuff, but also there's a sort of hidden element of it. And almost in a sort of Heideggerian way, we don't see the tool until it breaks, and, Amazon Web Services breaks, and suddenly everybody realizes, oh yeah, how much of our life is dependent upon this infrastructure. These are key elements of infrastructures, and I think the platforms have taken this on and have sort of moved from, sector to sector in the economy, but also, different spheres of our lives are becoming populated by these core digital infrastructures as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think increasingly it's not just like tools we're using these days, right? We're going on a web browser, surfing the web, but we are really almost in like this condition where networks are ubiquitous, right? Like they are surrounding us in everyday life, and they are really shaping also the way how we think and interact with each other on a very profound level. And I think especially in the age of AI now, that 1/5 of of the entire population of this planet is using ChatGPT on a daily basis, and a lot of other AI services, like our thinking and understanding of the world is very shaped through these tools, and it makes them just very pervasive. And if you want to riff a bit, maybe there was this report, I think, by Cooperative, which was called Network Realism, I think, which was kind of like a play on Mark Fisher's work, of course, of like capitalist realism. This kind of, I think, like leads to the question, is there still an outside to the network, or are we just like, is our condition really to live inside of these structures at this point? Sophia, do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Maybe taking a more philosophical approach to it, I would say that the outside exists, perhaps in theory, but we do often romanticize the outside. Like there's a renaissance of movements proposing that we build an off-grid cabin, or that we take more digital Sabbaths, but I don't see them as actual exits. There may be partial outsides. Even if even if you want to build an off-grid cabin that requires a solar panel, you still depend on transnational supply chains that, for the most part, are dominated by big tech platforms. And so I think that the situation today, even more after obviously the information and digital revolutions, is that it's very hard to create actual spaces of disconnection. The only thing that is at our disposal is to modulate participation in this enmeshment of different networks that have different degrees of centralization of decision-making power. That would be my take on it.
So if the network is kind of the environment or the water we're swimming in, then the question, of course, becomes like, who is operating these environments and to which ends are they kind of like designed? We live, of course, in a day and age where platforms are becoming very omnipresent and very powerful. Amazon, X, Meta, Alphabet are integrating and dominating a lot of the services which are very core to our societies, right? Like, let's just think of X, who is becoming very powerful in shaping the public sphere. And of course, then by proxy, their decisions on how to design specific algorithms or protocols in these kind of social media environments really have a profound impact on how discourse is being shaped and how we are engaging around topics as citizens as well. Nick, you wrote a book called Platform Capitalism and are currently in the process of publishing a new book called Silicon Empires. What's your take on the role of platforms and how they're positioning themselves as like these new, very powerful political entities?
Yeah, it's complicated. So when I wrote Platform Capitalism back in 2016, it was published in 2015 is when it was written, the core of it. It was sort of peak unification between the tech sector and the political sector within the United States. It was, Obama cozying up completely to Silicon Valley, loads of, Silicon Valley executives going to the White House and White House, employees going towards tech companies and, this whole sort of revolving door going on. And more importantly, there was this core sort of interest that was shared by Washington and Silicon Valley. Whatever Google and Amazon and Facebook wanted to do around the rest of the world was also good for American power and for American interests as a whole. So there was this real sort of convergence of like these corporate interests and seeking after profit fundamentally, but also the geopolitical interests of the American state at the time. And so in platform capitalism, I don't talk a lot about the state because in many ways, they weren't an important actor at that point in time. It was a facilitator of the profit-oriented goals of these corporate companies. I think that's changed today, though. I think that it's a much more complicated situation today. And this emerges most notably with Trump in 2016, but also Biden continued it, and Trump 2.0 is continuing it as well, where there's a much more of a focus on geopolitical elements. And here you start to see a tension, I think, between what tech companies want and what the state wants. Big tech would be happy to have the neoliberal world, the globalized world, a free trade in goods, services, data as well. But that's not what's on the cards anymore. The state wants something quite different. The state wants economic security. It wants to make sure supply chains are controlled by them and allies. They want to make sure that technology is not getting into the hands of China and other countries that they see as foes. So there's a real, I think, divergence here that is relatively novel. Like it's the past 10 years that there's been this real split between Silicon Valley and Washington interests in America. So I think that, if at one point in time there was this point where platforms could sort of just simply take up these sort of political roles quite easily, increasingly they're having to fight against the state in order to sort of get what they actually want. Having to make deals with Trump, but also make deals with Biden, make deals with the EU, make deals with Gulf states that they may or may not want to. There's a lot more, I think. There's less sort of clear power centrality to these big platform companies today, which is interesting in its own right. And yeah, maybe we can talk about some more of that later on.
Right, but I think also on the flip side, of course, like these countries have to negotiate with platforms, right? Which is also an interesting observation because to a certain extent, they managed over the last decades to basically unbundle specific governance services, which were traditionally associated with nation states or legacy institutions under the rule of nation states, like the media sphere and the gatekeepers of newspapers, of course, or also identity management, which is moving on platforms and on digital service more and more. Then you have, of course, like financial and economic infrastructures and so on. And over the last, especially I think since Corona, there was like a move towards very much integrating a lot of these services in these vertical structures of platforms, which makes them, of course, very powerful because they're not only monopolizing one specific market anymore, but they're integrating a lot of different services into these kind of vertical stacks, which gives them kind of like more comprehensive, I think, powers all of a sudden. And so to a certain extent, I'm also interested in exploring a bit the question: can we observe kind of a move from platforms as more kind of like market shaping entities to somewhat of like state or empire like like figures or entities, Sophia?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. We, Felix and I, and Primarda too, perhaps we have a tendency to use the lens of policy or the state to analyze how new sovereign entities behave. And so I will try to do the same here. The way I look at it is that these platforms more and more perform certain governance functions that before were in the hands of nation states. And for example, we can see it with rulemaking, right? Like these platforms set up usually terms of service or content policies that basically de facto define what is permissible speech, what is permissible behavior. We have it with, for example, YouTube community guidelines or Apple App Store's review guidelines. Also, like these platforms perform things such as adjudication, right? They operate private dispute resolution systems. And the problem with it is that most times this happens without transparency or recourse. We have the case of Meta. They have these oversight board reviews. We also have the case of X or TikTok, where this is done more on a case-by-case basis. But we also see, for example, them performing taxation, if you would call it in that way. So these platforms do extract some sort of rent from the economic activity that you conduct in them. And that is basically a mandatory fee for the users of participation on them. We have examples on, Apple's 30% App Store commission or the Amazon seller fees. And, finally, they do also do enforcement. And that is something that is super interesting because whereas states usually do enforcement after you violate a rule, for example, what platforms do is basically design the space of agency a priori before you actually can take an action. So perhaps it's not that they forbid people from taking certain actions, but that they simply delete a button that allows you to do the same thing. And so this, it may sound a little bit abstract, but what I'm trying to say is that in the operations, in the services, and in the goods that they provide, they do take away from the governance functions that states usually perform. And also that is amplified by the fact that states more and more rely on these platforms themselves. So we have, examples from, I think in the UK, it is well known that they use Amazon AWS services for storing some of the data and so forth and so on. So I think that's the lens through which I see that happening today.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this is it's not only like digital services which are being integrated in these stacks, but of course increasingly also like physical infrastructures. If we think of AI, and Nick, I'm very interested to hear your opinion on this. But then we see these supply chains of data centers, of places where data is being processed up to the services which are at the front end, of course, being used by citizens and users around the world. How would you describe this? But you also touch a bit upon the limitations. Of course, like this is not absolute power that platforms are wielding, but it is in this complex way layered, of course, with the powers and the sovereignty of nation states as well.
Yeah, I guess the way I sort of see it is, so there's definitely an expansion of these platforms into traditional fields of where the state operated. I think education is one of the most obvious ones, particularly after the coronavirus lockdown. Everybody's suddenly moving to virtual education. And that's sort of continued on afterwards as well. There's been studies which have shown that, the sort of uptake of cloud infrastructure use by universities and other educational institutions, it went up pretty massively as a result of the epidemic. So there's more and more dependency in that. There's more and more dependency, I think, in healthcare as well, although this is still, I think, a somewhat novel area for platforms to get into. And then the big one, which isn't talked about nearly enough, I don't think, is the field of the military, the field of national security, an increasing reliance on these platforms for the provision of secure environments for storing data and other sorts of things. So there is that sort of dependency of the state on these platforms, and it's interesting because sometimes you'll actually see. I've seen military officials in the U.S., for instance, come out and explicitly say this dependency on big tech companies is a threat to our national security, precisely because the interests of these two groups don't converge. Now, America, though, is in a relatively unique situation. I think a lot of what we end up talking about in terms of dependency on these platforms is, in fact, European countries and the rest of the world being dependent upon American platforms. Because America, I think, fundamentally has the capacity, if it wants to regulate these things and sort of orient these platforms in the directions that it wants. I think, partly what I think explains Mark Zuckerberg's complete personality change over the past year or so is a genuine fear that Trump might throw him in jail. Trump has said he wants to throw him in jail. So there is the capacity of the US state to change these things. Other countries do have to worry about that dependency much more, especially with the sort of, the way in which a lot of this infrastructure has been increasingly overtly weaponized. That capacity for weaponization has been there for a long, long period of time. But Europe, for understandable reasons, believed that it would never be operationalized. The US would never weaponize that infrastructure against them. That's changed. And I think that's completely changed the rules of the game. There's much more focus now on this dependency. Dependency of the government, dependency of financial institutions, all of these sorts of things. So yeah, that's sort of the way I see it. I think there's a complex series of interests involved here that aren't always neatly aligned.
Right. So there's this emerging landscape of different actors who are basically competing over power and influence over network infrastructures. And now we position the nation states, which are either trying to regulate or build their own kind of stacks to a certain extent. Like we see also these examples in Russia and China, where they're creating walled gardens with somewhat independent infrastructures to have more sovereign power over these kind of systems. And we have, of course, the platforms. But then there's, of course, a third dimension here as well, which is civil society. And I wonder what the role of citizens and communities is in shaping and governing these infrastructures at the moment, at least, Sophia.
Yeah, I think building on what Nick was saying, I do see that nowadays there is a clear struggle between three types of actors that are trying to regain control of, let's call it, this stack or the network infrastructures and the network platforms. And so, as we said before, we have states trying to reassert some sort of legal authority over digital infrastructure and platforms. And they have two ways of doing that. They try to regulate it, maybe by passing laws that are trying to constrain how private tech companies operate. And they also are trying to exercise direct control by developing state-owned, platforms and infrastructures. So that's one side of the equation. Then we do have, again, still corporations, big tech, that are always trying to expand their infrastructural ownership. And they can do it because of the vertical integration that I think Nick mentioned before, and also network effects that work in their benefit. But the way they operate this infrastructure is, we could say, primarily extractivist. So it's basically oriented towards creating, data capture and dependencies so that you can continuously increase growth and control. And there's a third sector, we could call it civil society, and that can be as wide as including, cooperatives or NGOs, activist movements, open source communities, or, decentralized autonomous organizations. And what they're trying to do is to contribute to a commons-based infrastructure. And that means is, in one way or another, moving the needle towards having infrastructure and platforms that are collectively owned and are self-organized. And so, to your question on what can civil society do or how that plays out, I think I will be very interested to hear what Nick thinks. But I think there are basically three strategies that are at the hands of civil society to regain control in this tension. I think number one would be pushing for a greater oversight of existing infrastructures that are privately owned. And so we see that, for example, now with data centers. I am Argentinian, and I don't know if you saw the news, but Sam Altman announced that they're moving, or they want to open a data center here in Patagonia. And we have examples in Amsterdam and in Chile of communities coming into or demanding to be taken into consideration to have a say in how these data centers are operated and the environmental consequences and so forth. So that's strategy one. I think the second strategy is civil society participated in mechanisms that embed plurality and accountability into what we call like the code or the architecture. So an example will be the Plurality Institute with Pooja Oliver and Glenn Weil and Audrey Tang. That's an example of people that I consider civil society trying to build mechanisms that allow us to control these infrastructures and make them more inclusive and participatory. And then obviously the third one is that civil society develops its own infrastructure. That would be the hardest of them all, but I don't think it's naive to think that that is possible because it has been done before. We have, for example, I think the name of it is Wi-Fi.net in Catalonia or in Spain. It's this sort of a collectively owned internet. It's pretty huge. So it can be done. And yeah, I think that's a space, the horizon of agency for civil society in the tensions of today.
You want to react to this, Nick, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with all of that. I think there's all really good points about what civil society can do. And I think that's sort of that first one as well, the efforts by Chilean activists in particular, but also, as you say, in other places in Holland and I think in Ireland as well, they may be pushing back. And here in the UK, there's sort of an incipient movement to push back against, the imposition of data centers in a local region, along with all the environmental costs that are incurred by it, and the energy costs and the water resources that are required in return for what is not much. Data centers don't create jobs. They often have massive tax breaks associated with them, so it's not like the state is getting tax back or anything like that. The return for a local region is very, very minimal, I think. So I think, pushing back against that is a really useful step in one level. I think as well, there's also efforts to, and I'll talk about AI in particular because that's what I've been focused on so lately, but develop AI in different sorts of ways. And this is where the open source movement, I think, has a lot to add to it. The open source movement is, in AI is most closely associated with two companies, with Meta and with DeepSeek. And, DeepSeek is not a massive company, but it's not a small company either. Meta is obviously a massive company. So there's no real alternative there to that sort of big tech if you're just, using Llama's open source stuff. But there are alternatives. There's, this Allen Institute. There's a variety of sort of more university-based approaches around the world that are also building open source AI in different ways. I think one of the real challenges for the open source movement in AI is so much of it is trying to copy what OpenAI is doing effectively and trying to compete at this level that requires billions of dollars to compete, tens of billions, hundreds of billions. And it's impossible. The open source community is never going to be able to compete at that sort of level. Where they can compete, though, is in sort of charting out alternative pathways for AI development. The transformer architecture, which is at the heart of ChatGPT and generative AI as we know it today, is, it's great for many, many reasons, which is why it's been adopted so widely, but it's not the only way to do machine learning. And before the transformer architecture, there were alternative ways. And even today, there are alternative ways being developed about, if we want something like artificial general intelligence that might lead to a world of plenty, LLMs, the transformer architecture is probably not going to get us there. We need to be thinking about these alternatives. And I think open source and universities and, alternative institutions that are not just these big tech companies, they can be the ones sort of charting out these different paths that are much more cost effective and much cheaper to do. So I think there's a lot of room for opportunity there. And then I think the third one is the application of this stuff, the application of AI. And here I would just mention the workers' movement, whether it's in the form of trade unions, wildcat strikes, whatever. The workers' movement has, I think, a big role to play in how AI is actually applied. So, is it going to be used just to increase the surveillance of workers? Is it going to be used to replace their jobs without giving them anything in return? All of these sorts of questions, I think, are absolutely essential, and trade unions need to be thinking about it, are thinking about it, but it needs to be a growing priority for them about how they can shape the application of AI.
Right. And I think we want to unpack this a little bit more because, of course, the umbrella for this series is this concept of network nations that Primavera, I, and a lot of other people are trying to shape at the moment, which is this idea of like what can civic networks do in terms of like building these kind of infrastructures and designing more democratically oriented applications as well. But I think before we want to zoom into that topic, I would love to come back to the question of like the political landscape we're operating in. So you're both describing that to a certain extent, the struggle for democracy is kind of like moving upstream from, like the day-to-day politics into the level kind of protocols, into the level of the design of the infrastructures of the network. And Sophia and I have been working on this idea and concept of network sovereignty, which is trying to basically describe the contours of this new emerging political landscape, which is moving beyond the idea of territorial sovereignty, which is this traditional idea around nation states that sovereign power, so political authority, is very much associated with the control over land, over a specific population, over jurisdiction, with geographic boundaries, and having basically like a legal apparatus of the state to enforce laws and so on. Now we have this new landscape, right, which we call network sovereignty, which is the idea that a lot of political activity is happening on networks, which then leads to the question of how are the infrastructures designed, who is ruling them, what is legitimating this rule basically, and how can we basically describe this kind of new network architecture of power. Sophia, maybe you want to add to this a little bit and help us unpack the concept and present the concept that we have been working on, and then we can maybe look actually at how power is playing out in this new political arena.
Yeah, sure. I think that it's very important for us to state that we're not the first ones at all, or the only ones who have talked about these concepts. There is a wealth of academic work on, network power and network societies. So I think what Felix, Primavera, and I tried to bring to the table, is a new lexicon to understand how sovereign network entities behave nowadays. And so that means that we have to unpack some concepts. The first one is obviously the concept of network. I think it's important to distinguish that when you talk about a network, it can be, as we said before, it can be an infrastructure, be it physical or digital, but it can also be a socio-political entity. At the core, any network obviously comprises a series of nodes and edges, right, that regulate flows of information and value. So if we now talk about socio-political entities that are networked, some of them are not only just groups, they're sovereign entities themselves. And so we decided to point to some of the features that these entities have. So obviously, the first one is it has to be a collection, like a distributed constituency of nodes that are not in one place. And obviously, this entity needs to have the capacity to formulate and to enforce its own governance rules. But the important aspect is it needs to do it with a significant degree of operational autonomy from external authorities. And one of the ways that they do so is by controlling to having a substantial control over the infrastructure that allows the entity to exist in the first place. And so the point being is that network sovereignties have existed since the beginning of time. But what we see is that with the emergence of new technologies, particularly digital ones, there are new network sovereignties that are very specific in their scale and in their nature and their reach. But comparatively to how states work, what we propose is that there are three changes that are happening at the same time. And those changes happen at the level of people, space, and governance. So if you think about the nation state, the people is basically like a more or less stable or identifiable group of citizens and residents that share either a legal status or the fact that they are living in the same physical territory. But when you talk about a network sovereign, and I will give examples later, so it's a bit more clear, the people is basically, as we said, is this distributed membership where you belong because you voluntarily decide to participate, because you adhere to the rules of the system. And, I mean, we have exceptions, but usually when you're a citizen of a country, you cannot be a citizen of another country. Um, However, in a network sovereign, you can actually completely belong to multiple networks at the same time. And that's actually almost always the case. Then the second change is in terms of space. So the nation state operates particularly on a physical space. It's a delimited territory, and that's actually one of the core prerequisites for the entity to be sovereign, that you know what your borders are and you police them. But the network sovereign doesn't have necessarily a physical territory. What it has is a topology. It's basically a collection of relationships between nodes. And the third difference is that if the nation state or the sovereign state governs through a hierarchy and a bureaucracy and the backing of the law and the monopoly of the use of force, in the sovereign network, the governance is imprinted in the code, is imprinted in the architecture itself. So as I said before, that means that the behavior starts to be regulated preemptively by designing the space of possibilities. And then at the end of the day, whether that is centralized or decentralized greatly depends on who controls the infrastructure, right? Who controls the servers, who determines the standards, and who designs the protocols. So just to close it, because I don't want to take too long on this, but the point being is, we argue network sovereigns have existed since the beginning of times. We have, for example, the Assyrian merchant network. We have the Sephardic Jewish diaspora. We have the Knights Templar that we have, mapped out to have these characteristics to be, operational, relatively autonomous. But we have now these emergence of new network sovereigns. And roughly, we have ones that we call platform empires, like big tech companies and the actors around them. Then we also have, efforts from nation states to extend their, influence into the digital world. But we also have network communities, for example, one of them being Bitcoin. And so it is through this new lexicon that we're trying to unveil and compare how the roles that they play in today's world and how that compare to more historical formations.
Does that resonate with some of the ideas you've been working with also, Nick? What's your impression of this kind of proposal?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does resonate. I think that's changed again over the past 5 years, really, is that resurgence of sort of active state efforts, at least, if not, in fact, sort of concrete actions to control these network sovereigns as well, to shape what they're doing. So I think there's two elements. One is that sort of resurgence of the state as its own political force, its own sovereign force, that's willing to impinge upon the sovereignty of these networks in various ways. Look, for instance, at all the efforts around so-called free speech with the Trump administration moderating social media nowadays. That's a very good example. Content moderation is no longer just up to these social media platforms. It's increasingly, Trump says he wants something, that's what happens. The EU says, this is how we're going to moderate these things. So that there's a sort of response there. It doesn't negate network sovereignty, but I think it adds in this extra force. The other thing is that I think there is, within the tech world itself, and particularly the big tech world, I think networks are primarily the preserve of platforms, not solely, but primarily associated with platforms, because platforms are sort of, networks with a giant hub in the middle, basically. So there's that element, but I think platforms are actually a bit in relative decline in terms of power. both in the US and in China. And I think this is a sort of curious turn over the past few years. You can see it in the fact that where's the money going right now? It's going to data centers. It's not going to building up new platforms or social media networks. It's going towards training an AI model, the production of this product, which can then be, rented out to people through an API. On top of that, you can also look at China. So China famously had its tech crackdown in, was it 2021? Crackdown on Alibaba, on Tencent, and a bunch of other different companies as well, and really reined them in and said, like, what you're doing, you can no longer do. And I think that this is actually sort of a mistake when we call it the tech crackdown, because if you look at the companies that were affected, it was platforms. The sort of hard tech companies like Huawei, like the lithography companies in China, like battery companies and the car industry in China, they weren't affected by this crackdown. They're all tech companies in various ways, but they weren't sort of rolled into this crackdown. It was the platform companies which were pulled back, and the state reasserting its control over these network sovereigns, if you want to put it that way. So I think again that there is this sort of multiple sort of competing centers of power, which I think the network sovereignty idea really gets at what happened over like the 2010s in particular. But I wonder if there's not other sovereigns sort of reasserting themselves today. I don't know what you
Yes,
think.
absolutely. And I think the interesting thing is that this is like not a map of like mutually exclusive entities, but they are in an interesting way layered, right? So we see how the sovereign influence or the political influence of networks and of big tech, of course, is kind of like stacked with the power of nation states. And there is some points where these are actually complementary and mutually reinforcing, and other points where there's contention. But we're moving a little bit away, and I think that it sounds like this is kind of a common observation from this world where power used to be at least largely be monopolized or at least centralized in the nation state system globally. And now we're moving into a landscape where we have different entities which have kind of quasi at least sovereign functions in society, and which are, as I said, like layered and kind of like almost like in this multipolar in a certain way. So it's somewhat resembling, we're going back to something what we had also in more medieval times, right? Where we had the church and like the state and, local sovereigns and so on, like all enmeshed in this kind of structure where you had like different political authorities basically who, like were competing over and collaborating over constructing, power relations in society. So I think like another takeaway from this is so that also the design of networks is highly political, of course, and the stakes are getting higher and higher to have influence over the design of these networks. And I think what we want to discuss maybe now is what civil society can do in terms of building their own networks. And so we described a little bit already, like what are the options that civil society has. And of course, some of them pertain to paths of resistance, others to, like using the tools of the nation state in terms of regulation of existing platforms. But a third path, which is the most difficult one, as Sophia also said, but also potentially a promising one, is developing their own stacks, at least in specific domains. There's like a huge challenge, of course, because the costs and the resources needed, for instance, to emulate like the stacks needed for AI, so large that it's to a certain extent seems unrealistic for civil society to build something which could compete on that level. But I wonder what the spaces are, and I think the Web3 community, for what it's worth at least, has attempted to build in specific domains infrastructures which can create options for citizens at least to fall back to and to maybe evade the rule of specific platforms, or also to partially nation states when needed. To a large extent, of course, or to some extent in the Web3 community, these ideas are very much ruled by libertarian ideals, sometimes even right-wing ideals. And the question would be, in a way, like, what is the opportunity to use some of these methodologies and some of these kind of like tools which these communities, but also the open source community, for instance, have developed over the past decades, and how can we use this to build political leverage and agency for civil society. Sophia, you work a lot on Web3 or with Web3 communities also, so maybe you have some ideas that can help us unpack it a little.
Yes, I was listening to you carefully and thinking about an answer and how to go about it. I think I'm actually very curious on Nick's opinion on this, and I think that maybe my area of expertise is diagnosing problems more than proposing solutions. So I'm more of a critic than anything else. But I do think there's something important to talk about before we go down that road and about Web3 is that I've been part of the, if you want, the Web3 ecosystem since 2016 and 17, and what I see in there is there is a wide array of political affiliations, as you say. Like you have, the cyberpunk movement, you have a solar punk movement, a lunar punk movement, a VC movement, all coming together, Bitcoin maximalists, all coming together with different assumptions. And that also translates into the political realities that communities propose. We can see it, if we want to take a minute to talk about it, like we can see it, for example, with what happened with the network state from Balaji and with experiments that derive from it. And so personally, when I read the network state, I basically agreed with the diagnosis that they had made about, the state becoming as its sole sovereign, becoming like territorially rigid and bureaucratically slow in like a new world where you have digital technologies mediating most of life. But then I was quite disappointed at the political proposal that they put together for two reasons. So one of them being it was a little bit repetitive of what we already had, and it was a little bit problematic. So basically, for those that haven't read the book, Balaji borrows from the market and borrows from the state to propose this new society. So basically, the network state is a bit of a venture property. It's like privately funded. It's like a startup society that's built through capital accumulation and token issuance, selective membership. But it also seeks to be state itself. So it wants to crowdfund physical territory and gain diplomatic recognition from existing nation states. And the second part that I think is a bit problematic is that for Balaji, there is a huge emphasis on exit. And that goes with what Felix was talking about, this huge libertarian influence in the Web3 ecosystem. So the main political course of action is the capacity to leave any existing political system and build new ones from scratch. But then he says very little about how governance takes place once that exit is achieved. Although we can sort of gather from the figure of the CEO leader that he talks about that he's in favor of introducing hierarchy and centralization. And so with all this very long narrative, what I'm trying to say is Web3 does provide opportunities for building this intermediated infrastructure. But what that infrastructure takes us to is undecided. It obviously has to be influenced by specific political lens. And I do hope that we're going into a more, solar punk and commons direction. But I don't have the solution to it. So I give it to Nick.
I'm going to disappoint because I don't have the solution either. I mean, I will say on the notion of exit, I always thought that, the real issue is not exit, but entrance. That's the major political issue in so many countries at the moment. So yeah, exit's fine and everything, but who's actually, I would love if entrance wasn't an issue, but it is in so many places. So that needs to be considered too. On Web3, I always found it probably more than most of my sort of Marxist colleagues. I found it more interesting and more palatable than most. Partly because I think there's sort of a few different elements, as you were saying, different communities involved in Web3. And the one that got all the attention, of course, was the financial hypesters, the scamsters, the people just looking to make a quick buck off of it. For, in some cases because they were the ones running the scams, and in other cases because they were simply, this was like buying a lottery ticket for them, hop on the latest token and hope that it skyrockets and whatnot. But that's sort of what got all the attention. But behind the scenes, if you really delved into the communities, of course, you saw there are lots of people with really decent political goals of decentralization, of moving away from big tech, of trying to build an alternative infrastructure. And I thought there was always something there that was, worth holding on to from a Marxist perspective, and trying to say, well, Bitcoin's not the answer, but like there's something to Web3 and to blockchain in general. I don't know what's come of that because I haven't followed the scene all that much over the past couple of years. Collapse of NFTs and things like that has meant that, it seems like a lot of it has sort of disappeared. But I'm sure that there are people doing fantastic work at the moment, and I hope that something comes out of it, in the coming decade that like provides an alternative to the infrastructure as we have it now. I will say that there's one warning element for the Web3 sort of scene that I always thought was important, is that if you look at Web 2.0, Web 2.0 was seen as this massive decentralization away from these portals that you got to the internet through. It was seen as like decentralizing power to users and giving them all sorts of new sway. This is Yoke Bankler talking about peer production and the commons and all of this sort of stuff at that time. And then it all disappeared. It got wrapped up into platforms. And I think that tendency towards centralization is always there. And it's not just a matter of like building a decentralized infrastructure and then hoping that people come to it. Decentralized infrastructures have to offer proper, real, convenient alternatives to a centralized world. And I think the sort of convenience of a lot of centralized platforms is what drew people away from like, the technical difficulties of getting involved in a decentralized world. So there's that sort of element. And I think you saw it as well in like, the crypto scene, certain exchanges becoming central, despite the fact that fundamentally these things are all decentralized, everybody would turn to these quite centralized exchanges to do their transactions and keep their wallets and things. So there was already that centralization pressure there. In terms of proper alternatives, I mean, one thing I always find quite interesting is some sort of cooperative platform. I think there's a lot of value and potential in cooperative platforms, in part because the technical hurdles are not immense and the financial hurdles are not all that immense either. You can build an alternative to Uber. It has been done relatively cheaply, relatively easily. And then you can have it run in a way which is, owned by say a municipal government or something like that, and thinking about values beyond just profit. So things like congestion and traffic pollution, all sorts of other different things you might want to consider. So yeah, I think there's a lot of value in cooperative platforms, but they need both protection by the state from big tech, because so many of these cooperatives that sort of flourished for a little while were demolished by Uber, undercut by them. And they simply couldn't survive. They also need not just that protection from the state, but also the support from the state for investment and scaling and development and all these sorts of things. So I think it is possible, but I haven't seen the political will from the state side of things to actually support a proper alternative here.
Right. Yeah, I think, and that's interesting because that leads us kind of to the question of what's the adequate politics that we should push for. That there are a lot of nascent, I think, experiments which would be worth, at least trying to scale. Platform cooperativism is one of them, of course, but there's also interesting initiatives in the open source communities. There's some experimentation of how commoning can be supported by digital tools, etc. But often it's a lack of resources and scaling pathways, which require also then political support, I guess, on a nation state level, as you say, in order to create regulatory frameworks for them, in order to create, access and entry to larger markets, and also like offer basically accessibility, or like create basically help them grow so they can actually become infrastructure to society at large. You wrote in, I think, 2016, quite an influential book, at least it influenced my journey to a certain extent, which was called Reinventing the Future, which tried to sketch out this pathway of a progressive politics, which is embracing actually technology and the design specifically and building of technology, rather than just critiquing it. I think to this day, it's a bit of a malaise, at least in progressive communities, that a lot of energy is leveled or like channeled towards a critique, but there's not a lot of like initiatives which focus on building alternatives and then trying to think around these questions of how to resource them and so on. At the same time, I think what's interesting as well is that we can observe across the political spectrum, from Ezra Klein's Abundance to, Alexander Karp's The Technological Republic, there's like recently a growing interest in how to use the state in order to build public interest tech. And then it's to be defined what is the public interest, right? Different political camps have different opinions here. But I'm just wondering like how you look at this, like, because these are in a way like also, accelerationist kind of politics. What is the state of affair here, and how do we have to think about, building a movement around these questions?
Yeah. So I will say there's a sort of accelerationist movement within the AI world at the moment. But it's the most sort of brutally reductive idea of accelerationism, which is just like make things go faster, accelerate the development of technology. What for? Who really knows? There's not really any clear sense of it. When Alex Williams and I wrote Inventing the Future and Accelerationist Manifesto, the idea was, drawing upon Deleuze and Guattari's work, that capitalism as a social system was, as every other previous social system has been, the sort of liberation of potential forces from that underpin humanity as we know it. But then it was a reconstraining of them. So like it liberated us from the feudal era, but then it reconstrained things in terms of, the pursuit of profit, competition at a systemic level, and wage labor most fundamentally. The demand that you have to go out and work this many hours at the behest of somebody else in order to receive an income to survive. It's a fundamental constriction on our freedoms. So for Alex and I, the project of accelerationism was always about unbinding these elements of capitalism and trying to find a sort of order beyond capitalism. And our focus was on wage labor. So trying to reduce the amount of wage labor that's required for humanity to do through the use of automation, through, social movements around a shorter working week and all sorts of things. So the drive for, technological development for us was never just this sort of like faster at all costs sort of mentality. It was the push for technological development fundamentally in order to support the liberation of humanity from work. And any other sort of technology was not in line with that. And today, we see sort of, I think, lip service to that from like the AI labs and things like that. Sam Altman will talk about it, and Dario Amodei will talk about it. And I've seen Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, talk about, in the future, we'll have a 3-day working week or a 4-day working week. They pay lip service to all these things, but there's never really any actual action towards that sort of thing. So I think that there is a lot of bottom up, let's say, appetite for this sort of political project. You could look at like the lying flat movement in China. You could look at the sort of quiet quitting movement after coronavirus. You can look generally at Gen Z's approach to work today and the sort of ways in which, both Gen Z and even the millennial culture sort of reject work as an identity. Work is something which is necessary, you have to do, but it's not fundamental to your life. It's not who you are. So I think that there is a lot of bottom-up appetite for more and more free time, more and more freedom. But for me, the real challenge is always, issues of power. Who has power? What are the hurdles to getting power? And how do we, both strategically pick our way through, but also then think about what tactics we need to successfully achieve these sort of political goals. And I think it's somewhat disparate at the moment in terms of the organization of this movement. It's more spontaneous than organized, I'd say.
Right. Yeah, and it comes back also to a question of where people are organizing even, right? Because a lot of these, they depend again on platforms to a certain extent, and then the question becomes like, to what extent can you organize resistance while engaging with the very platforms you're trying to resist, which is kind of a complex topic to navigate. We're coming to an end with this episode. Just maybe looking ahead to the future, what are projects that currently excite you in terms of like building alternative network infrastructures? Maybe you can share one or two with our listeners before we're closing the episode, Sophia.
Me? Okay. Can I share the name of researchers? I think
Yes,
that
of course.
that's more okay. So I will take the opportunity to give some shout outs. I would recommend everyone to follow the work of Thai American Martian Manon on data centers and maybe cooperative approaches to ownership of data centers that should be coming up soon. Obviously, also Nathan Schneider and everything he has produced with Exit to Community is very valuable for this question as well. I'm currently at Edge City, Patagonia in Argentina. I do think that this community brings together a lot of like-minded people who want to see and produce a better future. So recommend anyone who wants to visit to do so. And I think that's it on my side.
Cool. Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, it's difficult. I will say, so researchers I find interesting in this area at the moment. I think Karen Haas' book Empire of AI is a really great introduction to the AI world right now. And at the end, it offers a number of, I think, really good suggestions for where we might take things. It's not fully substantiated or anything, but I think it's a really good basis. I think Evgeny Morozov has done some really interesting work on what like an alternative vision of AI might look like in the Boston Review. Cecilia Rykap, Argentinian, has also done some excellent work on digital sovereignty and what this might mean around the global south and things like that too. And then I think in terms of questions, I think there's a couple of interesting ones. You know, the data center one, as Sophia mentioned, is a really interesting one, but also open source. So how does open source AI sort of function in a world where it's dominated by companies like Meta? And then another one, which I think is somewhat under-recognized amongst the critical space, but is sort of being pushed a lot by the AI industry, is AI agents. I think there's a lot of potential, progressive and liberating potential within AI agents to do economic work, but also for political purposes as well, in terms of sort of delegating and distributing democratic initiatives and things like that. So I think there's a lot of research that could be done around AI agents to really push them in interesting, politically useful and liberating directions rather than just like, here's an AI agent that makes people money.
Cool. Thanks for the leads. I think these are all very interesting questions. Some of them we will touch in future episodes. Sophia, Nick, thanks for coming on the show today and sharing with us. It was super exciting and interesting for me, at least. I hope for all listeners too. And yeah, we will tune in for the next episode focused on commoning. Stay tuned.